to lead our thoughts to the topic at hand, which is converting science into advice, let me show you just a few slides to illustrate the issues that we will be dealing with. Political decision-making isn't simply a matter of implementing a science program, because there are many grounds for decision-making. The easiest and most common seems to be intuition. As most people, politicians also act mainly through intuition, as we learn from Daniel Kahneman's research in economic psychology, or psychological economics, whichever. There is also experiential or silent knowledge. This resides mainly in the ministries and the civil servants that often have been serving for a long time and know intimately what is happening in their field. And this is, on the one hand, a good thing because they know what is realistic and what is not, but it is also a risk because it often is an obstacle to reforms. They want to do the things as they've always been done. Values and ideologies override other considerations. For example, there is a discussion in many countries on euthanasia, when and if one should be able to terminate the care of very sick individuals, either passively by discontinuing treatment or actively by helping them to depart earlier. And this is not a medical problem, even though it's intimately tied with the medical condition of the individual. This is a deeply ethical and moral issue that has to be discussed in those terms, and the opinions are built upon those beliefs. Authorities and hierarchies are often overriding sensible decisions, as you all know. And the overriding concern for most politicians is economics. And economists are the most common advisors to decision makers, even though they seldom agree. Political expediency, of course, is a significant factor in decision making. Opinion polls dictate to a large extent what politicians want to achieve, and horse trading between parties is quite common and sometimes quite detrimental. If we have time later, I can tell you a glaring example from my own country that's ongoing just now in a social and healthcare reform. And then scientific information, and we like to think that this is the most solid ground because it's based on research, and evidence-based policymaking is something that should be strived for. But there are difficulties which we will be discussing. In the next slide is a list of things that were, this was actually from an article in Nature. 20 tips for policymakers to interpret science. I don't have all the 20 listed, but perhaps the most important ones. Real differences and chance cause variation, so that should be taken into account. No measurement is exact, as scientists well know. Bias is rife, both among investigators and among interpreters. Correlation does not imply causation, even though there is a clear correlation between the number of nesting storks in Central Europe and the number of births in Central Europe. This does not imply that shortage of storks causes a shortage of babies. Regression to the mean is misleading. This is a phenomenon that affects anything that keeps continuing things, they tend to revert towards the average. And at times we have peaks, at times we have troughs, but in the long run they tend to revert to the mean. Controls are important in research. This is particularly true in medical research. Randomization avoids bias, and there are pitfalls in statistical significance. Statistical significances and the p-values have achieved a dominant role in not only in what scientists say, but what journalists publish. And this is oftentimes a pitfall. And saying that we need more research is simply... data dredging and cherry picking is very common, particularly in the organizations that act at the boundary of science and policymaking. Think tanks, lobbyists, they tend to pick the type of research that pleases them and their aims. And finally, scientists are human, they can make errors. As a response to this Nature article, the political editors of The Guardian newspaper published their list, which is on the next slide, 20 tips scientists should know about policymaking. And firstly, making policy is really difficult, which I think we can agree to. Policymakers can be experts too. There is a common thinking among scientists that the reason politicians do not heed scientific advice is that they are ill-informed. There is a deficit of information, and if they only learn what wise results science can offer for them, they will then change their policies. This sort of is called the deficit model in science advice. That is simply not true. It is not a question of lecturing from above to politicians. That does not help in the problem. Starting politics from scratch is really an option. It would be tempting to start from a clean table and build a rational political solution. But it's simply very seldom that one can start from a clean table. One has to deal with pre-existing systems. Economics and law are the top dogs of science in policymaking, and public opinion certainly matters. Policy and politics are not the same. And I think this applies to many most languages. Policy means a rational way of planning how society should be developed. But when politics comes into play, then we have special interests and party interests at play. There's a difference in timescale. The political timescale is the election cycle, usually 4 or maximum 5 years. In science, that is about the time that it takes to plan an experiment, let alone have the results. And we need more research is the wrong answer. In fact, the British Medical Journal has forbidden the use of these words in the articles that they publish. And even worse is, we need more money. And finally, also, policymakers are human.